So good evening, everybody, and welcome to the splendid Playfair Library. I'm Christina Boswell. I'm Vice Principal for Research at the University of Edinburgh, and I'm absolutely delighted to welcome you here to celebrate this evening the 2023 TAM DL Prize, and to hear more about the work of the very worthy recipient of this year's prize, Dr. James Cook. So I'll just say a few words about James and his research and his impact and why we thought he was such a worthy recipient of this year's prize. So James has really enhanced the reach and enjoyment of early music for thousands of people across Scotland and beyond. And he's done this through bringing together scientific research on acoustics, historical archival work, archaeology, and music performance, so a real range of different disciplinary approaches to reconstruct the performance of liturgical music at the turn of the 16th century within a virtual reality installation of the Chapel Royal of Linlithgow Palace, which is fittingly located within the constituency which TAM DL served. Now, James obviously hasn't achieved this all on his own, and with all great examples of impact, he has built really crucial partnerships with a number of actors, and he's been very persuasive in getting a number of people on board as part of this very impressive journey. So he's been building outreach and engagement into his research from the very outset. And this included persuading the Binchois consort to commit to recording music in an almost airtight cube so that the acoustic could be as neutral as possible. And he also managed to persuade Historic Environment Scotland, who are owners of Linlithgow Palace, that a VR installation of early music was a really good idea. And it was indeed a very good idea. Following the research and initial user testing, which went very, very well, the VR installation is now a permanent installation in the undercroft of the palace, and it enables visitors to experience the reconstruction of the visuals and acoustics of the chapel while listening to performance of early music within it and being able to transition between hearing and seeing the past and the present. So a really special and unique experience. And I should say the music is also available on a CD, the first commercial classical CD to be recorded and produced in virtual reality. And it reached number 2 in the official specialist classical chart and spent 4 weeks in the top 20 and 5 weeks in the top 40. That's really impressive. And available in the foyer, I hope, James. It also garnered extremely positive reviews in the music press, many of which noted the scientific and historical research which underpinned the project. And the Binchois consort wasn't put off by this slightly odd recording experience. On the contrary, they found it produced an acoustic unlike any other that they'd experienced, and have stated a preference to continue to record in this kind of setting with this acoustic for all of their future projects. So that's really quite an impact. Now, James has enthusiastically promoted his work to the public through the media, and he's now working with Historic Environment Scotland on another experience for the public to enjoy and learn from. And his leadership isn't limited to his own research. In his role as Director of Research Innovation for the Edinburgh College of Art, he draws on his own experience to encourage and support colleagues to engage with external partners in innovative ways so their research can benefit the public. So I'm going to invite James now to the stage to tell us more about his work, and he may also give us a flavour of what we can expect at Linlithgow Palace, and I hope he's going to encourage many of you to visit and encounter the VR experience. You will have an opportunity to ask questions after James has spoken, so we'll keep questions to the end, but without further ado, I'd like to welcome James to the platform.
Thank you very much, and thank you all for coming. This is actually my first lecture since coming back from parental leave, so I will try and stay awake for all of this, and also look forward to having an audience that isn't crying. That will be very nice. So yeah, this is actually essentially 2 projects, which I've sort of grouped here under the title of Hearing Historic Scotland. Before I start, I just want to thank a few people. The Arts and Humanities Research Council, for funding both of these. COI Professor Kenny McAlpine, our postdoc, Dr. Rod Selfridge, Steve Connor, who's over there, who worked for Solius and now Lateral North, Historic Environment Scotland, who of course own the Palace and helped us with LiDAR scanning, and Professor Andrew Kirkman and the Manchester Consort and Hyperion Records, who let us do some fairly strange things with their ensemble. Essentially, what this project was about was experiencing history in a slightly different kind of way. So it was trying to get at a sense of having an embodied sensorial experience of the past that was quite different from that which you might get perhaps from articles or books. And it was also about, I suppose, the sensation of extant music that was reconstructed within visuals and also acoustics. So it's to do with a sense of music having always been an audio-visual medium, but also one that is created for particular spaces. And another part of this was about making explicit this link between space, place, music, and architecture. So if any gamers are in the audience, you may recognize Il Duomo there from Assassin's Creed 2, a nice example of reconstruction there within a different sort of digital sphere here, but if you play that game, you can go and you can experience the architecture. You can move around the space, you can climb all over it, and indeed you can assassinate people inside it if you really want to. But interestingly, this is a space that obviously was very musical, but was also very musical in a very specific way. So we know the piece of music that was written to consecrate this church, Du fais nous per rosarum flores. And indeed, we know that it was written very specifically, or at least it's been argued that it's been written very specifically to represent the architecture. So a lot of the proportional aspects of two of the voice parts have been argued to basically directly relate to the proportions of the church. So this is the piece in question. So that's recorded there by the Orlando Consort, not within that space. So it's kind of divorced, I suppose, from its architectural particularity there, and is recorded, as most early music is, in a rather large nave of an open church to give you quite a large sort of bolstering acoustic there. So what we were really interested in trying to do was to reconnect the idea of the architecture, the space, the place, and the sound of the past as well. I suppose music generally can be thought, or at least music performance can be thought of the idea of people, but also places. This here is a reconstruction of late 15th century English church, and it's a physical reconstruction rather than a virtual one. But you can see there the kind of decoration that you would have expected to have for liturgical music of the period. So some of it is relatively abstract, but a lot of it is very particular there. The saints there that are enlivened in pigment are exactly the same saints that are enlivened in sound. So you've got this sort of reciprocality there and this idea of an audiovisual field. You're meant to see things that relate to what you hear, essentially. And if you think of your normal early music concert, we don't get that. We go to a concert hall, we sit in largely in darkness, and we have an empty stage, and people sort of perform divorced from that. And of course, a concert hall does not sound like a church either. So this here is a space which is quite reverberant. The other issue we have, of course, is that post-Reformation and indeed post-Victorian remapping of a lot of our sacred spaces, we've had all of the soft furnishings taken out as well. So even if you go and you perform this music in a church, it's not going to look or sound anything like how it would have done. So that's really what our project was about, was trying to get back to see what happens really when you record and have a performance experience within a space which looks and sounds hopefully as close to it as we could get. The other angle of this was the virtual reality reconstruction. So virtual reality as a technology, I suppose, is relatively new, but it offers us a lot of affordances that are quite different to some of the other things we might do. So obviously it allows you to explore the space, and we were quite quite happy with being able to do that. You know, you can go and do things you can't do in reality. If I was singing and you came and stood right up here, I probably wouldn't be very happy about that. But in the virtual reality space, you can go and stand inside the bass if you want to, and you can hear what it sounds like to be that singer, which is quite fun. So it allows you to move around and explore the space, and it means that you can really try out the different areas, see what the acoustic sounds like from different perspectives, and also I suppose it offers something that's maybe a little bit more interesting. It keeps, hopefully, the visitor engaged with what we're doing a little bit longer. The nice thing about virtual reality as well is that it's a very immersive technology. It collapses that distance between the eye and the screen. You're not really aware that you are watching something on a screen. You feel much more embodied and physically present within the space. So we were interested in exploring quite what that did, really. The space that we chose to do was the chapel of Linlithgow Palace. So Linlithgow Palace, the great pleasure palace of the Kings and Queens of Scotland, situated nicely between the capital here in Edinburgh and the main royal residence in Stirling. It's basically a sort of country escape. So people went there and the court sort of largely migrated down there. The singers would come down from the Chapel Royal. They used to cart the organs in on the back of a horse all the way back down. Whenever the king was present. It's also the birthplace of Mary Queen of Scots and James V as well, so it's a very important place. Now, of course, it's essentially a ruin clinging to the peel above the loch. We don't have any windows, we don't have a roof anymore or a ceiling. If you try and perform there, it's quite tricky. Not only does your voice escape through the roof and out the windows, you're likely to get rained on. So it's quite a difficult space to work with in reality now, but as a virtual reality reconstruction, it offers something quite nice. It gives you an opportunity to do something which realistically we can't really do. I mean, both for financial reasons and sort of historical ethics, I suppose. No one is going to rebuild the chapel there physically, but we can do that in virtual reality relatively simply. So the way that we went about this was initially to scan using LiDAR, which is basically a very big laser gun. It fires lasers around, and because we know how quick light travels through air, as it reflects back from the surfaces, you get a very, very detailed sense of the proportions there. It also records the colour of the surface that's being taken back. So you get what we call a point cloud, which gives you a sense of all the dimensions here. So this is essentially what you end up with. The issue with this is that the files are absolutely massive. You have a lot of polygons there, and once you start working in virtual reality and trying to compute acoustics and adding sound in there and anything else, you really can't run it without a very, very, very powerful computer. So our next step was to simplify this, reduce the number of polygons that you need in the model, so hopefully you've still got something which is detailed and as accurate as you can get, but which doesn't have quite so much in the way of data that we don't need, essentially. Over that, you can then overlay images that you've taken and get something like this. So this is in Unity, this is Linlithgow Palace in the present day. Any of you who've been there will probably recognise it. I should say the major difference here is we only did the chapel there, so if you walk through the door, you just fall into an infinite void forever, which is not what happens in the real palace. But other than that, hopefully you'd agree that it does look something like how it does today. So we were quite keen to have something that, was representative of the space that people could go in. But I've always been keen that virtual reality shouldn't just reproduce what you can do in reality. No matter how good our reconstruction of this now, I'd still rather just go to the palace and be in the space. So what we wanted to do was add something which goes a step beyond that, and which gives us something that you can't get just by going to the palace. And that was to try to reconstruct how it once would have looked. So this was quite a lot of work, bringing together standing buildings archaeology, archaeological reports, and spending a lot of time in the archives reading essentially expense reports for all of the various different types of materials. And from that we started to reconstruct what we think the space should have looked like. For instance, if you look at the doors on either side, there's actually currently no evidence that there were ever doors, which is interesting. There's no way you can actually affix a door in any of the surviving stonework. However, if you read through the account books, you can see that you get 11 elm of taffeta for a trevice. So a trevice is basically a large curtain. Sometimes it's used to mean sort of in a bedroom. Most of the time it's used in the sense of a chapel. So we've got these huge amounts of cloth built for the chapel, and you can see, particularly on the other wall, a surviving stone rail that goes across the top, which we're pretty sure is what it would have all been affixed to. So we started to be able to make sense of the space a little bit more and trying to compare what the archaeology of the building as it currently stands tells us compared to what people were buying at the time of building it. The roof and the ceiling, for instance, it's pretty clear that there were two different layers of ceiling work there. You've got joist holes that you can still see for both of those. The first was slightly lower than the second, and that fitted the time that we were trying to reconstruct. Annoyingly, we don't have any records of the construction of the first, although it's pretty obvious how it must have functioned from the surviving joist holes. But we've got lots of details, for instance, about the decoration of the ceiling. There's a man called John Ross who painted the lining of the chapel ceiling in a fine azure, and he also painted 12 pendant knobs under the chapel loft. So we've got quite a good sense of the sort of decoration scheme of that that we were able to kind of work with then. Similarly, the windows, we've got really good accounts from slightly too late. This is the theme of this. We seem to have very patchy information, often excellent information at just the wrong time, and then a lack of information just when you want it. But yeah, there's some really good information there about the 1530 replacement windows, for instance. So here we basically went and looked to see what other royal residences had at the time. We know that around the same time there was these relatively simple coat of arms decorations on Stirling Palace windows. So we've copied those essentially. So some of this is certainly, hopefully, intelligent guesswork, but we've had to kind of refer to similar buildings as well to fill some of the gaps in. It's pretty clear that the walls used to be plastered, at least. There's remnants of surviving plaster there. And again, we've done, as you see in Stirling Palace, rather better survival there of the kind of painted tiles there, for instance. Again, it's very clear that there were statues of saints along the wall. We don't know which ones they were because they were removed in the Reformation. You've still got the niches there, which are beautifully decorated. We ended up choosing St Andrew as the patron saint of Scotland, Saints James and Margaret as the patron saints of James IV and his wife respectively, because the chapel was built around the time of their marriage. And we've got various things. The floor tiles, for instance, tend to have monograms of I and M in. So a lot of the decoration there seems to have been referencing their marriage anyway. So we thought they'd be good choices. And then St Michael, partly because Linlithgow Parish Church, which this building here, which is about 20 metres away from the chapel, is also dedicated to St Michael. He's also the patron of the Chapel Royal of Stirling as well. The composer Robert Carver wrote a very famous mass cycle dedicated to him too, and the James IV's colossal warship that was built at around this time was also the Great Michael. So we thought he's probably a pretty safe option anyway. So those were our saints. The floor, this was a relatively simple one. We've got 500 fragments of clay tiles from around there, and a lot of them have these I and M intertwined initials as well. We know a little bit about the making of the floor as well. The masons responsible were paid in 1507 and again in April, and when James IV visited Linlithgow slightly later, he gave them 42 shillings to spend on drink as a thank you, which again is a relatively common practice at the time. So yeah, from that we were able to build a sense of what the space may have looked like. I don't know whether I want to go as far as saying probably looked like. I think I can say that for some of it will stick with may. But what we've got is a plausible idea of what the space could have looked like at least, which is something a little bit like this. The other big part of what we were trying to do, of course, was to reconstruct the acoustics. So that was a fairly large step. Once we've got the proportions and a sense of what it looked like, we can then start to think a little bit about the materiality of the space. Of course, when you've got a sound source like me, if I clap my hands now, this won't work because we've got speakers, of course, but yeah, if I clap my hand now, that sound is coming to you directly, but it is also bouncing off the floor, off the ceiling and taking rather a longer time to do it, and it's coming to you from a bunch of speakers now and bouncing off the floor there, for instance. But we can map that, so we get a sense of the direct sounds, the echoes, the reverberation. Gradually, as that goes on, you get less energy in that, but you can map that quite nicely. What you can also do is record it as a WAV file to use in a convolution reverb plugin. So we can take the acoustic of this room, for instance, and you can record anything you like using that acoustic. So what we needed to do, essentially, was to create this acoustic signature for the space that we've just created so that we could record our music within it. What that means is poor Rod having to go through basically every inch of the Chapel Royal and tag it with the coefficients relating to how much sound scatters and is absorbed for every frequency for all of the materials we thought. So you can go through, you can find out how an oak beam tends to treat sound in a particular shape, and we can tag all the way across our roof to do that. So that took a rather long time, so thank you, Rod. But what that gives you then is a nice, plausible reconstruction of how sound should work within that space. We then tested this against sort of physically captured sound as well. So we also reconstructed St. Cecilia's Hall, for instance. That was one of the other spaces that we worked with. And this was a very nice space to check versus what we call a sine sweep, which generates an impulse response. So basically, exactly how I described there, you start with a very low frequency, it shoots up to a very high frequency, and you can see how the room deals with all of those frequencies and generate that as a WAV file. You can then also rebuild that room in acoustic simulation software, so Odeon we used, and you can test your model that you made in the virtual world against the real building and compare. So we did that, we checked that with listeners and found that unless you were an extremely well-trained acoustic specialist, you couldn't tell the difference, and that you can also check that mathematically, and found that yes, our model was pretty accurate. It was much harder to test the Linlithgow model itself because it's full of bats, which was a problem because they are not particularly happy when you play very loud, high-frequency noises at them in the middle of the day. So we ended up sort of testing that our methodology worked in buildings that were slightly easier to control than outside and full of bats. But yeah, we're fairly happy that what we've got is an acoustic which is pretty accurate and is a good representation of the space that we've sought to reconstruct. Just to show you sort of how sound works differently in the space as the present day and the past, this is just some readouts taken from Odeon. Obviously, sound does not actually travel as bouncing balls. This is just a visualization of it. And I think, yeah, the whole of this lasts less than a second. So this is obviously slowed down a lot, but you can at least sort of see how the sound moves through the space here. So this is our reconstruction for the early 16th century with nice drapes which are keeping the sound in and with a functioning ceiling and actual glass in the windows. This is quite a nice example actually just showing how the sound there is sort of moving. You get the reflections far earlier across the width, and it takes a really long time for sound to get there once it's gone sort of the full length. And the interesting thing, of course, is that we assume probably that this is, you know, a concert, and maybe people are stood there and watching, and your singers are facing the audience, except for, of course, they're not. They're actually singing to the altar here. So really what they're doing is singing straight into a giant cloth curtain. So that sense of the sound actually taking a little while to get down there is quite an interesting one. This is the space as it is today, and as you'll see, an awful lot of the sound energy here is leaving into the little ambulatory there, or leaving into the antechapel, or indeed leaving straight through the complete lack of ceiling. So it's a very, very different kind of space, and we see that again here. Some of it there is sort of escaping through the windows and things. So yeah, just a brief visual example there of sort of how the space functions that little bit differently. Okay, so once we've got that, we've got a pretty decent sense of what the acoustic would have been like. We've got a pretty decent sense of what the visuals may have been like. We now need to record some music. What we would normally do, the Bachois Consort, who are there in our anechoic chamber in Edinburgh, what we would normally do in this kind of setting is record within probably the nave of a large church, because any of you who are singers, singing in a large acoustic generally makes you feel pretty good. It offers a lot of support, and I mean, it hides a multitude of sins. You can kind of cover, if there's some infelicities in intonation or blending of vowels or anything like that, you generally feel pretty good when you're singing in a nice acoustic. The issue you've got there, of course, if we recorded it like that and then overlaid the chapel acoustic, we would just have this weird hybrid that would be two acoustics shoved on top of each other. It wouldn't really show us anything. So what we needed to do was attempt to record in as neutral a space as possible. So anechoic chambers, you tend to use it if you're a physicist. You tend not to use it if you're a musician, because it is horrible, really, really horrible. You can hear the blood in your own ears. It's extremely off-putting. You have to be an extremely confident singer not to give up and walk out pretty quickly. Yeah, you can hear everything that goes wrong immediately. But what it does give you is a very, very clean signal that you can then drop into any acoustic you like and get a good sense of, okay, we have essentially rebuilt this and they are singing there now. The big challenge that we had, and that we really had throughout this project, was that blend of arts versus science here. And we wanted something that was going to work musically and be something that people would enjoy, but also something which was scientifically robust. And this was one of the big challenges here, trying to marry historically informed performance practice versus a sort of a scientific method that was going to be rigorous. So in an ideal world, we would have individual singers in there, and we would multi-track entirely, so they would sing on their own, be just one, and you get a pure sound source, no bleeding. However, what you then get is a fairly dull and lifeless performance. You get no sense of them working together. There's no sense, really, of this being a kind of live performance, and it gets a lot harder to create something which is going to make early music enthusiasts happy, I suppose. What we ended up doing, because this room is so dead, basically you get nothing back at all off the walls. So if you record with a sort of very, very monodirectional microphone, close mic it, and have everyone facing in a slightly different direction at different walls, you don't really get any bounce back. So we were able to get it so they could all see each other out of the corner of the eye, all kind of respond to each other in an interesting and musical way, but we still got pretty good sound source separation so that we could place things within our space and have it kind of work, essentially. Nonetheless, it's still a really unnatural environment to perform within. So thankfully, they're a group that I've worked with for a good 10 years, so there was a degree of trust there. I think probably anyone else would have walked out quite quickly. But yeah, they stuck with it, and what we've ended up with is really good. But yeah, you have to kind of take performance directions. Obviously, if you're singing for something that works in a completely dead room, it's not going to work in the acoustic we've tried to recreate. So we spent a lot of time going back and forth, listening to how it sounds with the acoustic overlaid, trying to work out what tempos to take, trying to work out what to do with vowels, and make sure that you've got something that really worked, which took a lot of time, but I think was really worth it in the end. Obviously, you then sort of cut this all together and end up with a nice recording. Once you've got that, you've got your music, you've got the acoustic, you've got the visuals, and it's time to kind of bring all of that together. We use various bits of software for this, and they've all got different pros and cons. The sort of outputs from this project were pretty multifarious in the end. We ended up with different things that sort of had different advantages and different downsides. Odeon is superb if you want a very, very accurate rendering of the acoustic of a space. It's kind of industry standard really for scientific measurement. But what it will do is spend a very, very long time rendering one sound source and one receiver. So that's fine if no one is moving, but not very much use if you're wanting something that people can move around in real time. So Odeon is superb if you're recording a CD, as we also did, because you don't expect what you're listening to on a CD to move most of the time, and it would be very disconcerting, I think, if your sort of listening space moved as well. So that worked quite nicely. Things like Google Resonance and Steam Audio are rather better for dealing with essentially the game environments that we were using to reconstruct this. Google Resonance is really, really good for things like trying to differentiate where sounds are coming from. It's excellent at that. But what it lacks is much in the way of being able to control the acoustic properties of spaces very well. So from Odeon, we can get a good readout of this is what an oak beam does, and then there was nowhere to put that information into Google Resonance. So that sort of went by the wayside. That was not particularly useful for what we were trying to do. Steam was great in terms of the acoustics, slightly less good in terms of spatialization. But with that, basically, you could take the coefficients that you got from Odeon and just manually enter them into Steam and get something that was not quite as good as Odeon, but you could actually run something in real time and have people moving in the space, which was really, really useful to see. I mentioned before that we've had a number of outputs here. I think the main one is the visitor experience for use at Linlithgow Palace. I do have a couple of headsets here as well, if anyone wants to have a play. Or you can go and go to the Undercroft. It's currently attached to a big throne there, so you can feel nice sitting in a big throne as well. And we also have a commercial CD. As mentioned before, we think the first classical CD to have been recorded and produced entirely in virtual reality. And obviously both of these are optimized in different ways. For the CD, we're wanting something that works really for the early music aficionado. You want something which is really, really high quality in terms of the audio output, but you don't need to worry about it being interactive. Nobody really expects an interactive CD experience. The visitor experience for Linlithgow Palace, of course, needs to work for users in the palace. When we initially built this, we used a very, very powerful gaming computer and a wired headset, and you could walk about freely. So you mapped the whole of the palace and you just walked, and it was great, except for you would walk into walls. If we did this in the palace, you would walk into other people. There were wires all over the place, and there was several £1,000s worth of computer there, which would of course also mean that Historic Environment Scotland would have to probably employ a whole extra person just to guard the kit. So obviously what we had there really wouldn't have functioned as a user experience, and we ended up rebuilding it into something that's a little bit less interactive, but which works. You put it on your head and it plays. You don't even need a handset. You control everything with your eyes. You just look at stuff and select things. And that's great because you can tie it down to a throne and people can put it on and use it. They don't need to sort of learn the buttons. And most importantly, no one is going to sue us because they've walked out of a window or something. So we ended up having to, it's a shame we lost the interactivity. That was really fun. But what we have, I think, works far better as a user experience for people coming to the palace, essentially. I suppose I want to talk a little bit about the music that we recorded as well. To an extent, this whole project has really been about fragments. The building is obviously fragmentary as it currently stands, and we've had to do a lot of work to try and plausibly reconstruct that. But the music itself is also extremely fragmentary. This here represents a worryingly large percentage of the surviving music of 15th century Scotland. This is most of it, in fact. This was found on a slate in a drain at Paisley Abbey. So we really are lacking an awful lot of the musical material here. So not only are we reconstructing the building, we're also trying to reconstruct some kind of plausible repertoire here. And I should stress, I suppose, that this is not saying that Scotland did not have a musical tradition in this period. It absolutely did. We've just lost an awful lot of it. The evidence that it was there is everywhere. We just lack a lot of the dots on the page, sadly. So partly this is due to the Reformation, partly this is due to the fact that an awful lot of the records were put in ships at the Union of the Crowns, and one of the ones which probably had quite a lot of the music in sank really handily. So a lot of the music is sort of somewhere off the northeast coast of England, annoyingly. So we had to be quite creative in the way that we approached this. What we started by doing was trying to focus on a particular time. So we chose Easter Sunday, 1512. We chose this because we know that James IV was in Linlithgow Palace. He heard Mass there on Easter Sunday, and just after the end of that, he had his son James V baptised there, who was born a couple of days earlier. So we know he was there. We also know exactly what liturgy Scotland followed at this time. It followed the same liturgy as large parts of England, the Sarum Rite, which comes from Salisbury. And thankfully, England has admittedly not very many, but some surviving copies of that liturgy. So we have music from elsewhere that we know is the music that would have been sung here. So we were able to pick things for that. For the virtual reality experience, you hear the start of the service for Easter Sunday, essentially, in what we call plain chant, so that's monophonic, single voice song. That works very nicely from a historical perspective, but it probably works less nicely in terms of us testing what our acoustic can do, and it's also probably not truly evocative of what the king would have heard. It's chant. Surely on the most important liturgical day of the year, the king is going to hear some ornate polyphony. So we had to try and think our ways around how to handle that. The first thing that we did, I put myself in the shoes of the sort of choir master at the time. If I woke up on Easter Sunday morning, discovered the king was turning up and realised I didn't have a piece written, what would I do? Well, probably what I would do is I would take some chant and improvise polyphony to it around a technique such as Phobodon. So that's basically a way of improvising kind of homophonic, almost sort of Bach chorale-like music around the chant, which everyone would have known. The rules for that, thankfully, are written down in a manuscript called the Scottish Anonymous, which covers from about this period, and it tells you lots of different ways to do that. So that was quite handy. We could kind of put ourselves in the shoes of someone of the period and say, okay, how would I have handled this? I would have written something like this. So we wrote out that sort of improvisatory practice and had the consort sing some of that. Still, that probably doesn't go far enough in terms of the grandeur that you would have expected. So we also looked around for other pieces that might be appropriate. And thankfully, in a manuscript which is a bit too modern for our perspective, it's later 16th century, called the Carver Choir Book, there are a couple of pieces which seem to be from around about the right period. So this has been a manuscript which has long been associated with the Chapel Royal in Stirling, and of course those are the singers who would have come to Linlithgow to perform anyway. And there are two big mass cycles, so very large multi-part pieces within that, which are clearly late 15th century. They certainly would have still been in use in the early 16th century that we were looking at. I personally think they're probably Scottish. At the very least, they must be English, because I've recently identified the chant in one of them, and it comes from that rite that was in England or Scotland. So they seem like good pieces. They're about the right time, and they seem to have been in circulation in the right area. Do I know that either of them was ever sung in Linlithgow? No. But they're the closest we're going to get, I think. Interestingly, the piece that we picked for the CD itself is fragmentary. Annoyingly, there is one page missing right from the start. So I had to write half of the first movement. So voices 1 and 3 are me, and voices 2 and 4 are Anonymous Scott for the first half, and then we swap, and voices 1 and 3 are the anonymous composer, and 2 and 4 are me for the other half. We've got all of the rest of the movements, thankfully, so hopefully I've got a good enough sense of the style of what survives, that it's convincing. I suppose you can judge for yourselves. Okay, I'll show you a little bit of the application now. As I said, we've got a couple of headsets at the back if anyone wants to have a go, but this is what it looks like.
Hello and welcome to our virtual reality reconstruction of the Chapel of Linlithgow Palace. In this VR experience,
soon get the experience of getting uncomfortably close to the bass singer who starts to get very loud. Hopefully you can hear the change of acoustic there as well. You can explore that at your leisure on the tables at the back shortly. So yeah, hopefully you heard that change of acoustic there. It's quite nice being able to move between the past and present as well to see how we've reconstructed that. You may have noticed that our people are ghosts in there. This was done slightly to make them less distracting without doing essentially facial motion capture of the singing. You either have the experience of people just standing there very still and not moving their mouth, which is feels very weird when you've assigned vocals to each one, or you could sort of have them just doing this, which was even weirder. So we turned them into ghosts, which actually, and sort of kept them there as a static point between past and present, which actually I think kind of works. It would be lovely to try this in future with some facial motion capture. I mean, the technology has come on quite a bit there, so it probably is an option now, but wasn't really so much then. I mentioned the other output that we had. It was the Marshall Consort recording. We actually recorded not entirely different repertoire here, but we recorded a different one of those large-scale mass cycles for this, plus some other things. The main piece from that is what I now call the Catherine Wheel Mass. It's Horrenda Subdenda Makinamoto. It's basically a piece that's based around chant about St. Catherine being tortured on the wheel. It sounds nicer than the topic. But yes, I recently managed to identify that piece of chant and found that, yep, it's definitely from Sarum, so it's either Scottish or English, and it seems to be a work for St. Catherine. And because of that, we then recorded other music that's appropriate to St. Catherine around that would have been used in services. So again, Sarum chant, the liturgy from Scotland of the period for St. Catherine, both chant and that improvised polyphony as well as a Magnificat from the Carver Choir Book, partly because we really wanted to include a bass in there as well to see what that did for the acoustic. So we tried to have a nice range of repertoire there. Again, entirely recorded in an anechoic chamber, and the CD is released with the reconstructed acoustic, just as a slight payoff for having essentially locked them in an airtight room for about a week. You can buy the CD through that QR code. They may forgive me for having done that to them if we get some extra CD sales. But yeah, it actually worked out as a really, really nice example, I think. And one of the things that came out of it was it took us so much less time to edit the CD at the end, because with me sort of sat in the recording booth, it was so obvious whenever there was any infelicity with intonation or vowels or anything, just because, yeah, everything was so stripped back. What we've ended up with here is an acoustic that is entirely unlike anything we would have recorded in. It's really quite close and intimate. I don't think any early music group would have chosen to record in an acoustic like this. But given that the music that we've got is quite dense with a lot of parts interweaving, it does really help you hear that anew, in that you can hear how the parts relate to each other. It's not just kind of lost in this huge bloom of reverb. So yeah, we were really happy with it, and indeed the concert have basically said that they will only ever record now in these much smaller acoustics. And of course that is really more historically informed. Most of the large-scale ornate polyphony written in this period, it was either written for small household chapels, so something which is part of your house, essentially. Okay, a very big, very nice house, but still part of your house, covered in soft furnishings, relatively close, or it would have been heard in a side chapel. So most of these things are not happening in the middle of a large room like this. In fact, these alcoves here for the books are a pretty good approximation of a side chapel. If we imagine you go in there, we get 5 singers, and we get everyone singing, and we cover it with a load of drapes. that's the acoustic we're looking at rather than this. So I think what we've got here is something that's much more historically informed, I would say. And certainly for me, I think it's helped to kind of hear the repertoire anew. I think I'll leave you with just playing a little bit of that. Of course, it doesn't work in this room because what you will hear is the acoustic and then the acoustic of this room. So this will sound a lot less close and intimate than it actually does if you're listening with headphones. But you can get a sense of it at the very least. Just for comparison, again, you won't quite get the full effect of this because it is overlaid by this room, but I'll play you a little bit of the anechoic version of this. If you're listening to this with your headphones on, it pretty much makes your ears bleed. It's very, very disconcerting hearing something with no natural acoustic. I suppose what we're hearing now is actually what it would sound like if the consort were just here on stage singing, essentially. This is the acoustic of this room. But hopefully you can hear the difference. I think I'll leave it there.
So we've just got two things to do very quickly. One is to thank you for this incredible talk and for telling us so much about this wonderful, wonderful adventure that you've been on. I mean, interestingly, just before you were talking, we were saying, or you were telling me that you were hesitating, and your nominator, who nominated you for the prize, was hesitating about whether this was the right fit, given that it's a science communication prize. You're a music historian, you're based in a school of music in a college of art. But wow, I mean, this is one of the most interdisciplinary projects I think we've been exposed to. And the way that you've fused and brought together such a broad array of different methodologies and approaches, and the way you've mastered those yourself, James, is absolutely phenomenal and hugely impressive. And I think the other thing that's very much impressed me has been the extent to which you've engaged with publics and thought so carefully about what will really work to enhance that experience, that VR experience. And clearly that's paid off. And I think we're all looking forward to trying on the headset. We don't have a throne available.
No, I couldn't bring the throne.
The Playfair couldn't quite run to a throne. But we're very looking forward to experience that. But the key thing now, before I forget, is to actually give you the prize itself. So here we go, this wonderful plate here, engraved, and to congratulate you on this wonderful achievement, a really worthy winner of the 2023 TAM DL prize.
Thank you.